And Boris Johnson using everybody from Nadine Dorris to Volodymyr Zelensky to sort of advertise himself as potentially up for the job again. I do think it is quite an extraordinary situation that anybody is actually willing to entertain that. And
I'm joined in the studio by Sir Craig Oliver. He was David Cameron's Director of Communications, and he's now the host of a podcast called Desperately Seeking Wisdom, which is all about how to learn from moments of extreme challenge. Well, before we come to that, morning, Craig. Nice to see you. Before we come to that, I suppose we should talk about your old job in Number 10. Danny Finkelstein was saying earlier he didn't think reshuffles make much difference to anything. Is he right?
Well, look, I mean, the answer to that is it depends. I was interested in you suggesting the names of government departments because when we came to our first reshuffle, I went to a guy called Godric Smith, who'd been the Prime Minister's official spokesman under Tony Blair. And he said, whatever you do, be careful with the acronyms because they'd once named a department accidentally penis and had to change it. So that was basically the main thing that we were warned about. I mean, look, I think it's one for the aficionados today, isn't it? Or the connoisseurs. There's a couple of mildly interesting things. Greg Hands is a safe pair of hands.
Yeah.
It's interesting that they've created a department about energy security because energy, that scared the hell out of them when Ukraine happened.
Yeah.
And the ordering of that energy security and net zero, that they've put it in that order. But apart from that, I don't think there's a huge amount to it. He's thrown a bit of a bone to the people who say, look, where's the growth agenda by saying, look, technology and science. But I don't think this is going to trouble the Times' front page tomorrow too much.
Yeah, you may well be right. And also trouble the opinion polls, probably even less likely. Right, let's talk about your podcast then, because it's back for it's his second series, isn't it? So before we listen to some of the clips from it, explain the broad idea of Desperately Seeking Wisdom.
So just before lockdown, I was sort of in a situation where I sort of felt I'd hit the buffers and externally things were going well for me. I was in this, a new job as a kind of business consultant. I'd had a busy, fast lane type career, but I started to feel like I was really struggling to see much point or have a huge amount of enthusiasm for life. And I thought, look, let's try and explore some people who've got some clever things to say. And what's interesting when you first really try and delve into that, and I spent a lot of lockdown delving into that, is there's a lot of people who've got some slightly wacky ideas, but there's also some people who've got some pretty smart ideas. And I learned a lot from that. And the second thing was when I started talking to people about it, and when I was prepared to be vulnerable, I was surprised how vulnerable people were to coming back. And I asked some pretty well-known people, will you come on and talk to me? So to my great surprise, they said yes. So George Alagaya, the BBC News presenter who has terminal cancer. Richard Curtis talked about his immensely successful career, but how there was no amount of money and no amount of love that was ever going to save his sister from taking her own life. So amazing guests, really willing to open up and talk and then speak a lot about what they've learned. And we've got a great new series. It's kicked off now, available Desperately Seeking Wisdom. We've got Amber Rudd as the first guest. We've got the Reverend Richard Coles, Anthony Scaramucci, very interesting, John Simpson, Tanya and Nadeem Laperouse, who are the people whose daughter ate a Pret a Manger sandwich and had an extreme allergic reaction. Yeah. They're really fascinating about how did they rebuild their lives and how did they rebuild their marriage after that. So there's a lot in it. Lot to learn, and it was fascinating doing it.
Well, let's jump into some of it then. Like you said, Amber Rudd is the first episode. Former, in fact, she was a former energy secretary, wasn't she?
She was a former energy secretary, former Home Secretary, had to resign, came back into government again. And what's really interesting about her is it's not just the political stuff that she's learned about. She's married to A.A. Gill, one of our most celebrated journalists. She talks about being married to somebody who was, frankly, interesting and complicated. What it was like divorcing. How do you keep the kids on side when you're divorcing? Also about when she decided late on in her career to just have a complete change and go into politics. So all of these very interesting things, a lot of hinterland there.
Well, let's watch some of there's a clip here where you were talking about her famous comment to Boris Johnson during one of the Brexit debates.
There was a time when we met, the two of us. I was Home Secretary, he was Foreign Secretary. We had our meeting. There were a lot of cars outside because we were both protected people. And we came out and he said, "Come on, Amber, I'm going to give you a lift home." And I said, "No, I'm sorry. I have not changed my mind, Boris." And all the protection officers were just in a row howling with laughter. He'd obviously told them he was going to say, "Come on, get into my car," hamming it up.
Yeah, that was, you remember that famous comment she made to Boris Johnson during one of the Brexit debates, where she said he was the life and soul of the party, but he's not the man you want driving you home at the end of the evening. Let's hear just another part of the interview as well, where you go on to talk about the Conservative Party's relationship with Boris Johnson.
I think you'd be surprised that for a man hearing that kind of thing about themselves, saying that basically you're not safe in taxis or you can't be trusted around women, particularly in a kind of Me Too environment. I just think it's interesting, and it landed, didn't it? Really?
It did land. It did.
David Cameron said to me once in a private moment that he felt that Boris Johnson was almost like an affair that the Conservative Party had to have,
that's very good.
Even though in its heart it probably knew that it would end badly.
I think that's probably true. He's like a sort of a candle that the moths go round him the whole time, and they get burnt. They know it's going to end badly, but they can't quite resist it.
So what do you think, Craig? Is the moth going to go back to the flame again?
They're certainly trying to. He's certainly trying to attract them, isn't he? I mean, if you see in the last week, we've seen not just one but two former prime ministers trying to grab the wheel. Liz Truss yesterday and on Sunday, and Boris Johnson using everybody from Nadine Dorries to Volodymyr Zelensky to sort of advertise himself as potentially up for the job again. I do think it is quite an extraordinary situation that anybody is actually willing to entertain that. And have they accepted the reality that, he had his chance and it blew up? Brilliant column, I thought, today by William Hague in The Times, talking about, look, you had this golden opportunity and the only person to blame for it basically is you.
It's also interesting, and I'm sure you've had this conversation with David Cameron as well, that the club of former party leaders, former prime ministers, well, you basically, you know what it's like to be there. You keep quiet and you don't constantly rock the boat. It's something that he's done pretty stringently. I mean, Theresa May has her moments, but by and large isn't constantly caught in publicity.
Yeah, I thought what was interesting about David Cameron, almost to a fault, I think, never wanted to be seen as a backseat driver. He never wanted to be accused of the person who was reaching over from the backseat and grabbing the wheel. And I think his point was look, whenever that happened when he was prime minister, he found it deeply uncomfortable and deeply painful. I remember like a former leader, Michael Howard, coming out and making speeches about Brexit and why he was supporting it and that kind of thing. And I remember him saying to Michael Howard, look, can't you see the problems you're causing me? Yeah. How would you have felt if somebody was doing this when you were in charge? And I think that is definitely the case. There is a real problem at the moment where they are flirting with disaster if they continue along this path.
Just move on. Let's move on from Amber Rudd then. We'll because you mentioned some of the other people you've got on the podcast. Later in the series, you speak to Reverend Richard Coles, who talks about some of his campaigning on gay marriage. Let's take a listen.
I remember around that time going to Number 10 and David Cameron was there as a reception for the LGBT. I think that was that string of initials in those days. Community. And I remember kind of turning on my kind of token detectors to see if what he was saying sounded true. And I genuinely think it did. And I don't know David Cameron, but I imagine that he probably was on a bit of a journey with that, like lots of other people. But I think it was very interesting that we support gay marriage, as it later became, not because we wish to destabilise these sort of institutions which hold societies together, but because we wish to reinforce them.
It's really interesting hearing someone not at all from the world of politics coming, up against politics. And also, I'm not doing actually Richard Cole's politics, but people suddenly think, oh, I'm on the same side as the Tories. And that's a slightly awkward thing as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. And I actually remember one of the highlights of being in Number 10 was actually being able to go to the White House. And one of the big fundraisers, the LGBTQ fundraiser for Obama, saying it's so interesting that you as the Conservative Party are doing this and yet we haven't done it yet. What's really interesting, I think, about the Richard Coles thing, though, is that given what's going on not far down the river from us now is, Lambeth Palace, that the Church of England is discussing whether or not how acceptable it is to bless marriages, whether or not they could have marriages and gay marriages, and saying they're not. And it was fascinating talking to Richard Coles, who is a committed Christian and also obviously a gay campaigner. What's it like being part of an institution that says that somehow you're second best? And it was interesting how he rationalised it and spoke about it. He said, the church has always basically done things that are wrong. Its slavers have been supported, and currently there are people blessing bombs that are going to go to Ukraine and kill people in Ukraine. Yeah. So it was fascinating seeing how does he reconcile those two contradictory things in his life.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. I know that's later in the series. The Amber Rudd one's out now.
The Amber Rudd is out now, Desperately Seeking Wisdom, wherever you get your podcasts.
Lovely stuff. Craig, lovely to see you. So Craig Oliver, thanks so much for joining us on Times Radio this morning.